After the battle at Stamford Bridge and the resultant negotiations, Harold then took 8 days to return to the south. During this time, William established a couple of fortified positions at Pevensey and Hastings. These secured his supplies and gave him somewhere to fall back if the English then surprised him. Two rival commanders now had some vital decisions to make, and these choices were key in deciding who would rule England. William was in a rather tricky position. Winter was coming, he was in a hostile land, his troops, especially his horses, required substantial amounts of supplies just to keep them going. The weather turned bad again, so he couldn't get substantial supplies or reinforcements from across the Channel. He had two real options: remain where he was, raid the local area for supplies, and wait for the English army to turn up and hope to be able to defeat it. Alternatively, he could march on London, take it, and have himself proclaimed king. Whilst a march on London would seem to have considerable advantages, in numerous places along the route where his column could be ambushed, he was well aware that many scouts were actually reporting his position back to Harold. William's army was caught unprepared on the march. It's almost certain it would be heavily defeated. The retreat from such a position being possible would be too far for boats to safely recross the Channel. However, remaining where he was also presented a major problem. The longer he waited, the more time he gave Harold to assemble a large army against him, and the potential numbers that Harold could assemble, William's relatively small army would stand relatively little chance against those numbers. Then again, his hired troops were wanting payment, action, or to return home. But with William controlling the boats and the poor weather, his last problem was at the moment not a great one. So for the moment, William decided to remain where he was, sent out raiding parties for supplies. Whilst this was essential for the survival of William's army, it may have actually been one of the most significant elements of William's campaign. The land that William was raiding for supplies were the lands under the general control of the Earl of Wessex, and Harold had a rather personal interest in those areas remaining intact. In the meantime, Harold assembled his troops in London and took advice from the other nobles on what course of action was best to take next. General advice was to wait for more troops to assemble, for troops that already fought in the early battles to time to recover from their wounds and exertions. It was sound advice, as William was going nowhere. Given enough time, Harold could assemble an unbeatable army to oppose William. However, the character of Harold here was key. He was an army commander whose campaigns had been successfully based upon aggressively taking the initiative. In addition, each day that he waited, more of the land was being looted. He also hoped to catch William by surprise. If he could catch the opposing army unprepared whilst it divided foraging for food, he thought he could ensure an easy victory. So instead of waiting, he decided to confront William, took all the available troops, the majority of the local nobles, and ordered all other forces to follow him as quickly as possible. One of the problems for Harold was this conflict wasn't going to be purely a clash of infantry. William had a substantial amount of cavalry at his disposal. And unlike Harold's troops, these weren't infantry mounted occasionally on horseback. These were troops trained to move and fight from the back of a horse. It meant the chance of moving thousands of infantry up to William's position without being observed was virtually impossible. So any hope of taking William's army by surprise was next to nil. So it was on the morning of 4th of October 1066, both forces were aware of each other near Hastings. With the possibility of an ambush now ruled out, Harold took up a defensive position on the top of Senlac or Colbeck Hill. It was an almost perfect defensive position. It's on top of a fairly steep slope, with woods protecting either flank and a marshy area at the base of the hill. Now, with the prospect of an ambush or catching William's army whilst it divided was out of the question, Harold didn't actually need to defeat William. All he had to do was not lose the forthcoming battle. With Harold's army this close, William couldn't weaken his army to gather supplies. The longer Harold remained undefeated, the more troops would swell his ranks, the more likely William's troops were to desert. Time again was on Harold's side. Harold deployed his troops across the top of the hill in a traditional shield wall, with the housecarls with their better equipment in the front rank. The intention was to let William batter at the shield wall till his troops were exhausted. Certainly, if William had a similar army to Harold, and it would surely have been a winning tactic. However, William's army was made up of 3 different groups. Most importantly for William were his knights. His highly trained, well-armoured troops normally give his army mobility and flexibility. However, these knights didn't fight in one huge mass cavalry unit, they fought in small groups of around 10 horsemen, normally formed around a particular lord or noble. It meant they really lacked that kind of powerful thrust that could break through solidly organised infantry formations. Unfortunately for William, he sent his cavalry against Harold to charge uphill against the housecarls locked in that shield wall formation. Against such a formation, the knights were virtually useless, and William couldn't afford to lose too many of these key troops. Next part of William's army were the infantry. These were solid, reliable troops. Not on quite a par with the housecarls of Harold's army, they were better than the third, which represented the rest of Harold's army. However, one of the key elements of infantry at this time was being organised as a group. Again, charging uphill against an organised shield wall was no more likely to succeed than the cavalry charge was. The final element of William's army was that of the archers. However, these were not the medieval longbowmen with their devastating weapons with its 300-metre range and penetrating power against armour. The Norman archers' range was barely 100 metres. They lacked penetrating power to go through the armour and shields of the troops in the front rank of Harold's army. In addition, they'd also have to fire uphill, which reduced the range and penetrating power still further. The other limitation they faced was that normally archers only carried about 20 arrows each, with the extras either being supplied from the camp or from those fired with the other side. Now, with Harold's army lacking substantial numbers of archers, it meant that the Norman archers would soon run out of arrows to fire. Now, given all of these limitations, William was unlikely to be able to defeat Harold on the hill. Given the pressures upon him, he had to try. Really, the only sensible option was the one that William attempted: to try and soften up the English line with the archers, and send infantry to batter against the shield wall, finally send in the cavalry to exploit any gaps that the infantry made in the shield wall. Unfortunately for William, the result was a complete failure. The archers failed to make any impression on the wall. When the infantry tried to march up the hill, they met at close range with thrown javelins, axes, and even rocks from the men standing behind the shield wall. The result was that the Norman infantry, in their disruptive state, could make no headway against the shield wall. This in turn meant that the cavalry following up behind the infantry had no gaps to exploit, and just presented large targets for the English infantry on the hill to slay. The end result was some of the less enthusiastic mercenaries that William had hired saw no hope in winning this kind of fight, and attempted to move back down the hill again. The effect of this withdrawal was to turn into a general Norman retreat, which was hastened by the rumour that William himself had fallen in the conflict. Harold now had 2 choices. He could either maintain his virtually unassailable position on top of the hill, wait for the Normans to reorganise and attempt another, probably futile, attempt to break the shield wall. Alternatively, he could order all of his troops down the hill and attempt to turn the retreat into a rout and end the battle at this point. Fortunately, what appears to have happened was neither. It appears to be a partial charge led down the hill by some of the English troops, possibly led by one of the 2 remaining brothers of Harold. Retreating cavalry, however, managed to quickly outdistance the pursuing infantry, and then those knights rapidly rallied when it became clear that William was still alive. These horsemen then turned round and charged back against the English infantry, but no longer in their impenetrable shield wall formation. As a result, they were vulnerable to the countercharge of Norman cavalry. While some of the English infantry made it back to the top of the hill, they left many of their comrades dead on the slopes of the hill. Both sides then paused, possibly to feed and re-equip their troops. As the battle progressed, especially in the Norman counterattack, Harold had lost many of his housecarls and had to fill his front ranks with the less reliable third. At this stage in the battle, it's possible William, having now seen the futility of battering against the shield wall, saw another way of beating the English at Hastings. He could tempt the English to pursue his troops down the hill, following a feigned retreat. He could then turn upon them out of their shield wall formation and cut them down. Alternatively, this tactic occurred naturally during the battle, with each failure of the Normans to break through the English line and the subsequent Norman retreat from the hill. What's also certain now is that the archers who had been resupplied had the fear to fire at rather than the housecarls. They were a little bit more effective than they had been earlier in the battle. In addition, third, being less disciplined than the housecarls, were more inclined to follow the 2 or 3 retreats of the Normans down the hill. The eventual result was that the casualties sustained in these pursuits down the hill meant that Harold no longer had enough troops to occupy the whole length of the hill. William's troops could start to occupy some of the hill without having to charge uphill against the infantry. At this stage in the battle, both sides may have lost around a third of their initial troops. That's a huge number. The fighting, which had started not long after sunrise, was continuing, and it was still starting to get dark. Unless William could break the English, and soon they could withdraw during the night, gather reinforcements, and start the fight all over again at a later date. The final attack, with the Norman troops now able to get round the flank of the English, are finally able to penetrate the English wall. At this point in the battle, Harold was slain, possibly but unlikely by an arrow. In fact, it's more likely that a Norman knight killed Harold. With the death of the king and many other nobles, including both of Harold's brothers that were present, with the army unable to form a consistent shield wall to keep out the attacking Normans, the English army finally broke and fled into the gathering darkness. William's Norman army had won the Battle of Hastings, but with his force seriously diminished, did he really take the whole of England with just a few thousand battle-weary troops? Even when William tried to pursue some of the fleeing English troops, the cavalry were either ambushed or fell into a concealed ditch in the darkness. So what hope did he have in seizing the whole of England?